So in this video, I'm going to be going over our notes for Learning Target 1 and 2. Learning Target number 1 is going through a couple different descriptions or titles with animals, and then Learning Target number 2 is applying them in food webs and in food chains. So for the first topic, producers are organisms that can produce their own food, right? Can produce their own sugar, their own carbohydrates. These are generally plants, right? Or what we think of as plants, because they can do photosynthesis. They can create their own source of energy. Another word for this is autotroph. Auto meaning they're doing it themselves. Troph talking about trophic levels, which we would talk about in a second. So some examples: oak trees, algae, grass. Really, anything that does photosynthesis is a producer. And then again, they're an autotroph because they are taking in their own energy, they're creating their own energy. A photoautotroph would be taking in light. Photo meaning light, right? Just like photosynthesis. So these are things that take in light energy and then create their own carbohydrates from that. By taking in CO2 through the process of photosynthesis. So photoautotrophs, again, are all plants. Chemoautotrophs take in chemical energy, such as sulfur hydroxide, and then they produce their food that way. These are things like that ocean critters that live in the very bottom of the ocean, what is called hydrothermal vents. So there are not very many of these that we are going to talk about. Generally, when we're talking about producers, again, we are talking about photoautotrophs because we're talking about plants. A consumer, this is not necessarily a consumer like we're in terms of an economic consumer. This is more of you are consuming something to get energy from it, to get carbohydrates, to get sugar from it. So examples would be a tiger, a monkey, humans, dogs, rabbits, really anything that you think of as an animal is going to be considered a consumer. Even if you are not consuming another animal, you are consuming a producer, right? Sometimes these are known as heterotrophs because they are not creating their own energy. And there are a couple different types. Most of these terms should be very familiar to you. Herbivore, they are eating plants only. Omnivore eats both plants and meat. Carnivore is only eating meat, right? Detrivore, or what we call decomposers, are feeding off of dead or decaying organic matter so that they are not killing themselves. That's really the important distinction here. Detrivores or decomposers, right, would be decomposing leaves, or like we're talking about maggots and stuff like that eat parts of a dead carcass. The maggots themselves are not going around and killing deer. The deer was killed by a wolf or something like that, or got hit by a car, and the decomposers are just kind of doing their job. And then there's the saprotroph, which is very similar to a detrivore or a decomposer, but these are secreting chemicals to break it down on the outside. So detrivores are taking it and then breaking down that energy, whereas saprotrophs are releasing some sort of chemical to break it down on the exterior of them. Another example of a decomposer would be like a vulture. Would be a good example of a decomposer because they're eating these dead pieces of predominantly meat, but So now that we've talked about those different terms, we can kind of lay them out in terms of how they are structured in the environment. So food chains, I know, is not something that's going to be new to a lot of you, but these are models to illustrate the feeding relationships between organisms. This is also how we get our trophic levels, which is showing how energy is flowing within the ecosystem from one trophic level to the next. In other words, where does it start in the producer? The producer is always going to be trophic level number 1, and then so on. It is possible when we look at our food web for something to be considered in trophic level 2 in one food chain, and then in trophic level 4 in another food chain. That's why food chains are not perfect. They are not great. They're a simplified description on what happens with the interactions between organisms in an ecosystem, but they are not the best description of what happens in an ecosystem. But anyway, so the first trophic level is a producer. Then the energy gets passed on to our primary consumer. Primary meaning like the first consumer. So I said in this case, I said a producer was grass. The primary consumer would be a rabbit. Secondary consumer would be a fox. All right, secondary, second. Tertiary, this means third. Tertiary consumer would be a wolf. And then I said that there was not an apex predator in this case. A lot of times you're not going to have more than 4 connections on a food chain, which we will talk about why that is the case later on, in this unit. But an apex predator is really just the top of the food chain. If we're talking about like in the jungle, it could be like a tiger or a lion. Or if we're talking about in the ocean, it could be like a great white shark or a killer whale would be an example of an apex predator, right? Because there would be like algae, and then small fish eats the algae, medium fish eats the smaller fish, dolphin eats the medium fish, and then killer whales would kill the dolphin, right? Or you could be like great white shark kills the dolphin, so they'd be the apex predator. A lot of times you're going to see that humans, if we were to lay it out in a food chain, humans would be the apex predator. But generally speaking, we don't make food chains involving us because we would just be eating literally everything, because that's what we do. For food webs are all of the food chains connected together. This is more so what happens in real life. It's not like an animal is like, well, that's not part of my food chain, I'm not going to eat it, right? So this is just all of the possible interactions between organisms in a ecosystem, all the relationships, all the connections there. In this case, I didn't fill it out with names because I felt like you guys were going to be very familiar with this. So I just put producer 1, producer 2, producer 3, and then our animals A, B, C, D, E, F. Just A, B, C, D, E. So it looks like producer number 1 is eaten by A and B. Producer 2 is only eaten by A. Producer 3 is eaten by B and C. And then from there, looks like A is eaten only by D, and B is eaten by E. E also eats C as well, though. So we can also look at our trophic levels from this. It looks like all of our producers here are trophic level number 1. Trophic level number 2 would be A, B, and C. And then D would be D would be the third trophic level, a secondary consumer, and so would E. So the reason that I was saying that you can be both you can be a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer is, let's say that D also eats whatever E is, right? Let's say E is a fox and then D is a wolf. So if I drew that arrow in here, let me get my arrow. Let's say I put in the arrow, that would show that depending on how you look at it, D, the wolf, could be a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. It could be a secondary consumer, or it could be producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, right? So it could be really at trophic level 3, or it could be at trophic level 4, depending on how you kind of look at this food web. And that's why I don't necessarily love food chains. I think food webs are a lot more close to what real life would look like in terms of the complexity of the interactions and the connections between organisms. So hopefully that makes sense. I think for a lot of you this is going to be review, but please let me know if you guys have any questions as you guys go through this. Have a good one, guys.